Small town beginnings. Nestled on the dusty plains of central Texas, Willow Creek wasn't the kind of place that made it onto most maps. Life here moved at a gentle, familiar pace. Mornings began with the low rumble of pickup trucks and the distant crow of roosters. Evenings ended with porch lights flickering on, kids' laughter echoing in backyards, and the smell of barbecue drifting through the warm air. For Sarah Miller, Willow Creek was more than just a hometown. It was a landscape woven into every memory. She grew up alongside the same faces she now greeted in the bakery, the same neighbors who'd watch her three lively kids dash down the street. Her husband, Mark, was a local through and through, a sturdy man with strong hands, always ready to lend a hand after his shift at the construction site. The family lived in a weathered white house at the edge of Main Street, a couple blocks away from the old diner and the single-screen movie theater that served as town gathering spots. Sundays meant church in the morning and potlucks in the afternoon, usually with someone bringing homemade pecan pie or fresh lemonade. In Willow Creek, everyone's business was practically public knowledge. Good news traveled fast, but so did the gossip. Sarah's days were filled with both routines and small joys. A fresh loaf of bread from Mrs. Jenkins, football games on Friday nights, Mark teaching the kids to fish by the creek that ran behind their backyard. She sometimes helped out at the PTA or organized bake sales for the elementary school. Always warmly welcomed and rarely left alone in a crowd. But beneath the surface of small-town comfort, there was an unspoken code of belonging. People here stuck together, looked out for each other, but they also remembered every misstep and whisper, every relationship and rift. Reputation mattered, and so did loyalty. For Sarah, this ordinary, close-knit world was a source of strength. It grounded her in hardworking values, shaped by generations before her. At the same time, Willow Creek was a place where secrets, once uncovered, could change the course of a life forever, rippling out through the community in ways no one could easily predict. Little did Sarah know, everything she took for granted in this small, steady town was about to be turned upside down. And it would all begin with a betrayal no one saw coming. Betrayed. It started like any other morning. Sunlight streaking across the kitchen table, the sharp aroma of fresh coffee floating through the house. Sarah watched her husband, Mark, lace up his boots with familiar routine before heading off to work at the local construction site. To an outsider, nothing seemed amiss. But lately, Sarah had sensed a subtle chill in the air, an awkwardness in their conversations, a distance in Mark's eyes that she couldn't quite name. As the weeks passed, the unease grew. Mark, once ready with a smile or a comforting hand on her shoulder, now seemed distracted, his phone always within reach, and screen turned away. He started coming home later, the excuses piling up, equipment malfunctions, overtime shifts, drinks with the guys. Even the kids began to ask, "Where's Dad?" more often than Sarah wanted to admit. The truth arrived in whispers. At first, just a flicker of gossip, barely more than background noise, in a town where everyone's business was everyone's business. "You heard about Mark?" someone mumbled on Main Street. "Spending a lot of time over at the auto shop." Sarah tried to dismiss it, telling herself rumors had a way of growing wild in Willow Creek. But soon, even her closest friends exchanged uneasy glances, their concern lingering in the silence between words. The final blow came one rainy afternoon when Sarah stopped by the auto shop to drop off some homemade muffins for an old friend. She wasn't prepared to see Mark through the window, standing far too close to a young woman laughing in the glare of fluorescent lights. The young woman, a recent arrival in Willow Creek and a trainee mechanic, had caught more than a few eyes around town, but Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her chest as she watched Mark brush a friendly hand across her shoulder. The confrontation that followed was quiet but devastating. Mark admitted he'd fallen out of love, that his feelings for this new woman had shaken up everything he thought he knew. He packed a duffel bag and left the house that night, barely able to meet Sarah's eyes.
Hello.
The kids wept. Sarah sat in the empty kitchen, coffee cold, reality flooding in a town as small as Willow Creek. News didn't just travel, it exploded. Neighbors whispered on porches, old classmates offered awkward sympathy in grocery aisles, and Sarah's family became the subject of relentless scrutiny. She was no longer just Sarah, the friendly baker and devoted mom. She was the abandoned wife, the woman whose husband had run off with someone young enough to be his niece. And through it all, Sarah struggled to piece together what remained of her dignity and family. The betrayal had cut not only her marriage, but her sense of belonging, leaving her alone against a storm of judgment she never expected to face. Stacked hardships, Sarah's world didn't just shrink the night Mark left. It seemed to collapse in on itself, one little piece at a time, beginning with the way silence flooded their once noisy house. Mornings became an exercise in courage. She would rise before dawn, making school lunches by the glow of the refrigerator, and setting breakfast for 3 children who no longer understood why their father's chair sat empty. There were days when her hand shook while tying shoelaces, nights when she pressed her forehead to the kitchen window, listening to the hush of cicadas and wishing, just for a moment, that everything could be the way it had been. Financial realities made themselves known almost immediately. Mark's construction job had provided the steady income that kept the mortgage paid, the lights on, and the pantry stocked. Now, Sarah's part-time work at Mrs. Jenkins' bakery, though a godsend, was barely enough to keep their heads above water. The bills piled up with relentless regularity. The heating bill, the overdue phone payment, the never-ending grocery receipts for growing kids who swallowed cereal by the box. Each month required desperate calculation. Each trip to the mailbox, another roll of the dice. But money was only part of the problem. In a place like Willow Creek, being a single mother was a public identity, whether you chose it or not. Sarah felt it everywhere, from the strained half-smiles at Sunday church to the subtle pauses when she entered the checkout line at the supermarket. Once regarded as a pillar of the community, a volunteer at the school bake sales, a cheerful face at town cleanup days, Sarah now sensed her every move was being observed. The pity in people's eyes hurt almost as much as the whispers. "That's Mark's wife. You know, the one he left." The kids, meanwhile, each struggled in their own way with the loss. Her oldest, Emma, grew quiet and angry, often shutting herself in her room for hours, with only her textbooks for company. Ben, her middle child, became the class clown at school, trying to laugh away questions he didn't want to answer. Little Maddie, still too young to understand, wandered the house with her worn-out teddy bear, asking plaintively when Daddy would come home. Sarah tried to be both mother and father, discipline and comfort, structure and softness. But some nights, after finally closing the front door on another exhausting day, she'd stand over the kitchen sink,
Good morning.
stare out at the empty backyard, and cry quietly so no one would hear. Then there was Mark's side of the family. Before the breakup, they'd been regular faces at Sunday dinner, always inviting Sarah to family reunions, potlucks, and holiday barbecues. After he left, the invitations disappeared, replaced with icy avoidance and curt words in public. His mother, once warm and overbearing, no longer called to check on the kids. At best, Sarah got stony silence. At worst, sharp rebukes about how she should have kept her marriage together. She overheard cousins at Little League games questioning her competence. Even neighbors turned distant, as if Mark's abandonment was contagious. At church, the community Sarah used to count on now felt like a tribunal. Sermons about forgiveness and humility stung, and she felt the weight of 1,000 sidelong glances during the potluck line. Friends who once showed up at her doorstep with casseroles and gossip now called less and less frequently. Some, torn between loyalties, drifted quietly out of her life. A few tried to offer awkward encouragement, but their platitudes, "You know, God doesn't give us more than we can handle," rang hollow. Sarah's self-reliance became both armor and burden. She learned to fix the wobbly kitchen table herself, to unclog drains, to wrangle 3 children into the doctor's office on her own. Grocery shopping became a carefully orchestrated affair, with coupons stacked and every purchase weighed. On weekends, instead of resting, she sold baked goods at the local farmer's market, hoping to squeeze a few extra dollars from brownies and cinnamon rolls. Sometimes, when the bakery was quiet, she'd let herself rest her elbows on the counter, gaze up at the sunlight dancing through the window, and dream about far-off possibilities she knew she didn't have time to chase. Still, every week brought new hurdles. The van broke down on the way to school, and Sarah had to convince a skeptical mechanic to let her pay in installments. Ben got into a fight at school, and she was called in by the principal, forced to explain, without excuses, how their life was changing. Emma refused to join the soccer team, mortified by the prospect of no one cheering for her from the stands. Bills went unpaid. The fridge ran empty. Once, Sarah found herself praying over a stack of unpaid invoices, as if appeals to the divine might conjure enough money just to keep their house another month. Yet, for every setback, she found small moments of grace. There were mornings when Maddie would crawl into bed beside her, tiny arms wrapped tight around her neck. There were evenings when Emma, after weeks of sullen silence, would slide into the kitchen and help chop vegetables for dinner, each gesture a silent olive branch. Sometimes, Mrs. Jenkins would offer an extra loaf of bread at the end of a shift. Just because, Sarah savored every little kindness, hoarding them like treasures against the darkness. The world outside their home often felt hostile, but inside, Sarah tried to cultivate something different. A stubborn, gentle hope. She let the kids redecorate their bedrooms, painting wild colors on the walls to chase away the gloom. She spent nights teaching herself to cook on a shoestring budget, transforming nothing special ingredients into hearty family meals. On weekends, when they couldn't afford outings, Sarah would organize backyard picnics or story time on the porch, determined to remind her children and herself that joy could still be found amid the struggle. Sometimes, after the kids were asleep, Sarah would sit in the dim light of the living room, looking around at the quiet, battered house. She didn't know what the future held, but she could see, between the cracks, possibilities for something different. She could imagine, if only faintly, a life where hardship didn't define her story, where dignity and strength were hers to claim. It was that fragile vision that kept her going, inch by inch, day by day, even as the world tried to tell her she couldn't do it alone. And so, in the face of mounting bills, social judgment, and heartbreak, Sarah refused to let hardship have the final word. Each small victory, a fixed sink, a paid bill, a rare family laugh, became a step forward, proof that she was more than her scars. In Willow Creek, where memories lingered and gossip never died. Sarah's struggle was visible, but deep inside, where battered hopes learned to grow again, she started to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Overcoming prejudice. After months of relentless gossip, cold shoulders, and the suffocating knowledge that her every move was being judged, Sarah realized that survival alone wasn't enough. She needed to reclaim her own dignity and, more than that, to redefine what others expected of her. The choice was either to shrink beneath the weight of their glances or to stand taller in spite of them. It began quietly, as most transformations do. In the brittle chill of early morning, while the rest of Willow Creek was still asleep, Sarah would bake, mixing flour and sugar, folding in butter and hope. She'd lose herself in the familiar rhythm of kneading, stirring, and waiting for the yeast to rise. The kitchen, once a place associated with conversation and family, became her sanctuary, a space where she could control outcomes, savor small victories. The extra loaves and pastries began as a practical measure. Money was tight, and the pantry often nearly empty. She figured if she could sell a few cinnamon rolls or pies at the church social, maybe that week's grocery bill wouldn't look so daunting. So, one Saturday, she packed up boxes of her best treats. Classic apple pie, pillowy biscuits dusted with sugar, her grandmother's soft rolls, and set up a modest table at the weekly farmer's market. She was nervous, feeling the eyes of longtime residents as she arranged the baked goods, knuckles white on the edges of her tablecloth. To her surprise, people came. At first, it was the kind ones. Retired folks who remembered her as a child, a tired teacher, looking for something sweet after morning bus duty, a single dad who needed breakfast for his boys. They chatted about nothing in particular, careful to keep the conversation light. Some regulars discreetly stuffed a few extra dollars into the tip jar, acting as if they hadn't. Most kept their curiosity to themselves. Over the weeks, her booth became a quiet fixture at the market. Each Saturday, she'd pull on her faded denim jacket, pack up her kids in the battered minivan, and set up shop. The children helped, arranging cookies in neat rows and tying bags with ribbon. Maddie, the youngest, would wave at everyone who passed by, determined to win even the flintiest hearts. The work was exhausting. Sarah would bake late into the night after the children fell asleep, her arms aching by dawn. On slow days, she felt the familiar twinge of humiliation, wondering if people's polite smiles masked judgment or pity. But the receipts in her apron told another story. Business was steady, and little by little, she started seeing the power of her own determination. Slowly, the attitude of the town shifted. Her baked goods started appearing at PTA meetings and book clubs. She was invited to share recipes on the local radio show. A tiny victory, but one that filled her with a quiet pride. When Mrs. Jenkins, the matriarch of Willow Creek's original bakery, offered her 2 shifts a week in a corner of the display case for her new pies, Sarah nearly cried from gratitude. The partnership made sense. Mrs. Jenkins was aging, and her steady hand was growing shaky. But her bakery was the soul of Main Street. For Sarah, it was both an honor and a lifeline. But prejudice has a long memory, and not everyone was quick to forgive Sarah for the simple crime of being left behind. Some women avoided the bakery when Sarah was on shift. A handful of parents quietly removed their children from her daughter's Girl Scout troop. She heard the comments, whispered just loud enough, a reminder that in Willow Creek, reputations were forged in fire and slow to cool. Sarah refused to let the bitterness seep inside. Instead, she channeled her frustration into work. She took free online marketing classes at night, learned to photograph her food, and started posting daily menus to a community Facebook page. The posts caught the attention of people beyond Willow Creek, college students from 2 towns over, long-haul truckers looking for comfort food, and eventually, a couple from Dallas who featured her in their food blog. Suddenly, Sarah's little table at the farmer's market grew into a line that curved onto the sidewalk. At home, the children sensed the change. Emma offered to babysit so Sarah could bake. Ben mowed Mrs. Jenkins' lawn for extra pocket money. Maddie took it upon herself to hand out little cards with, "Thank you for supporting Mama's Kitchen," written in crayon. Sarah watched them grow tougher, kinder, and fiercely loyal. Their home filled with the smell of cinnamon, the clatter of baking pans, and, to her relief, laughter. But the most significant battles were fought inside Sarah herself. Every morning before sunrise, she forced herself to look in the mirror and speak kindly, pushing back against the voice that told her she was not enough. She stitched up her confidence one day at a time, using the tools she had: kindness, hard work, and a refusal to quit. For every person who tried to cut her down, she chose to offer a warm roll or a soft word, not out of martyrdom, but because she knew this was how change came, stubbornly, in increments. Gradually, those who had doubted her, those who'd watched Mark leave and expected Sarah to fail, began to see her with new eyes. The stoic neighbor who never made small talk started picking up a pie every Sunday, swearing it was for his wife, but always eating half of it before he got out of the parking lot. Former friends, once distant, lingered a little longer at the market. Even Mark's mother, stone-faced and formal, dropped by the bakery one afternoon, pressed a neatly folded $10 bill into Sarah's hand, and left without a word. There were setbacks still, moments when an overdue bill or Maddie's tear-stained face brought Sarah to her knees. But more and more, she measured her days by the small wins: the sold-out tray, the thank you notes left on her windshield, the sense that, despite everything, she could still shape her own life. Sarah knew she would never completely erase the sting of what had happened. Willow Creek would always remember the summer Mark left. But now, when people spoke her name, it was less and less as a footnote to his absence, and more as a testament to her resilience. She had, by quiet force, turned the weight of small-town prejudice into the foundation of something stronger. And, as fall settled over Willow Creek, crisp air, orange leaves drifting down Main Street, Sarah let herself hope, if only a little, that the best chapters of her story were yet to come. Unexpected success. A year after her first shaky Saturday at the Willow Creek Farmers Market, Sarah's world had transformed. The slow, quiet determination that pushed her out of bed before sunrise and kept flour dust swirling through her kitchen each night had finally begun to pay off. First in small ways, and then, suddenly, all at once. It started with a new level of energy at the farmer's market. Word had spread about her apple pie and soft rolls. Locals, who would have once crossed the street to avoid her, now came early on Saturdays, hoping to beat the rush. The high school football coach always bought 24 cinnamon rolls for his team before a big game. The librarian reserved a pie each week just to make sure she didn't miss out. When the local news ran a short feature called Faces of Willow Creek, there was Sarah in a crisp apron, hands dusted with flour, smiling softly beside stacks of golden biscuits. Her children noticed the change just as much as the townsfolk did. It wasn't just the steadier flow of income, though that meant the world when paying the power bill. or treating the kids to a diner breakfast, but also the way Sarah herself started to breathe easier. Her laughter came a little faster. She hummed while sweeping the kitchen or taping a paper "sold out" gang sign to her market table. Emma, her teenage daughter, had been her toughest critic and her fiercest protector during the hardest months, and even she began to smile at her mom's growing sense of satisfaction. With success at the market came bigger dreams. Sarah put together a battered folder filled with numbers and doodled floor plans, and after endless calculations and a nerve-wracking conversation with a sympathetic banker, she took out a small business loan. The family scraped and painted and hammered, transforming a long-abandoned donut shop on Main Street into Mama's Kitchen, a place where the windows gleamed, the coffee was always fresh, and the scent of baking bread drifted out onto the sidewalk every morning. Opening day was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah barely slept, worrying about burned muffins, late deliveries, or, worst of all, the possibility that no one would show up. But by 6 a.m., a line had formed at the door. Farmers in muddy jeans, the high school English teacher, Mrs. Jenkins and her daughter, the elderly men who played checkers in the square. By noon, every seat in the house was full. Ben, her middle child, played busboy, while Maddie toted napkins and handed out cookies. Emma took orders at the register with a shy, proud smile. Sarah worked the kitchen, heart pounding with joy and exhaustion, moving with a surety she'd never known before. As weeks rolled by, the diner's reputation grew. First-timers became regulars, old-timers became friends, and the guest book by the door filled with scribbled thanks and stories. The best fried chicken south of Dallas. Reminds me of my grandma's kitchen. Don't ever change, Sarah. Truck drivers raved about her biscuits on trucking forums, and travelers began making detours through Willow Creek just to try lunch at Mama's Kitchen. The restaurant brought new rhythms and rewards. There were long, hard days, grace notes of burnt pastry, or dishwasher breakdowns, the exhaustion of carrying bread dough and balancing payroll in the same hour. But there was no going back. On Friday nights, after the last customer left and the kitchen quieted, Sarah often stood in the empty dining room, the soft light glinting on clean counters, pride settling in her chest like a familiar melody. She'd think back to the months of penny pinching and whispered gossip, of hands shaking over sinkfuls of dishes, and realize how far she and her children had come. Outside of work, the tides shifted too. No longer simply Mark's ex-wife. Sarah's name was tied to something people respected and needed. Neighbors came to her for advice. How to market a new product, how to stretch stew for another mouth, when to call in alone. She gave what she could, remembering how small kindnesses had kept her afloat during the darkest days. Word of her success even traveled beyond Willow Creek. One summer afternoon, a reporter from a Dallas food magazine stopped by after hearing about Sarah's cornbread and cinnamon rolls. The profile, published with a glossy photograph of Sarah and her kids on the cafe steps, brought an influx of new visitors and, eventually, an invitation to join a statewide food festival. The festival booth, manned with her children in matching aprons, was swamped for all 3 days and led to a contract with a regional coffee chain for her now famous pecan pie. At home, the mood changed dramatically. Emma's walls, once covered with angry lyrics and silence, bore cards and photos from their first official family vacation, a 3-day trip funded by the cafe's first summer profits. Ben, no longer desperate for attention, entered the county baking contest and proudly brought home a third-place ribbon. Maddie, still the family's heart, stood on a cafeteria chair during family night and recited from memory. "My mom is the best cook in the world." Laughter, tentative and precious, returned to the Miller house. Sarah felt the shift inwardly, too. The insecurities that had plagued her, the doubt and loneliness that crept into quiet hours, were far from gone, but they no longer controlled her. She could feel gratitude in her bones for the women who came early to help fold napkins, for the banker who'd taken a chance, for every hunger-panged hour that had forced her to create something beautiful with her own two hands. Mostly, she felt pride in having built, out of heartbreak and necessity, something sturdy and warm and entirely her own. Inevitably, there were setbacks, harsh Yelp reviews from tourists, a refrigerator that gave up midweek, or the painful conversations with customers who still tipped with pity. But even as Willow Creek shifted, slow to forgive the past, Sarah lived in the future. She hired her first staff, supported the high school soccer team, and started a scholarship fund for single parents determined to go back to school. On the first anniversary of Mama's Kitchen, the town surprised her. The mayor delivered a corny speech about community and home. The high school choir sang a bluesy tribute, and Sarah's children presented her with a cake bearing lopsided letters, "To the world's best mama." Through tears, Sarah hugged her children close, her heart full, standing there, surrounded by the people who'd watched her struggle and waited for her to fail.
The red sofa.
Sarah knew this was the beginning of something even bigger. Unexpected success, yes, but born out of grit, faith, and a simple, stubborn certainty.
Right here.
In Willow
The rare
Creek
earth minerals
and in her
confirm
own
this
life,
exact spot on the
Sarah had
satellite
finally claimed her own
That's the
name.
second site.
The one who left wants to come back. As autumn settled on Willow Creek, painting the maples and oaks in deep gold and amber, Sarah Miller's life
Here are the
moved
answers
with an
you've been searching
unfamiliar
for.
but welcome steadiness.
I hope this
Her
file
diner,
helps bring you
Mama's
peace.
Kitchen, buzzed
And the
every
master
morning
bedroom
as regulars
goes
chatted
right
over
here.
steaming mugs of coffee
It's
and
perfect,
warm
I love
cornbread.
Yeah, it's
The
really
smell of
something.
cinnamon rolls drifting
Fix-it was
out
not
onto
paid in
Main
money,
Street.
but
The
in a
town that
promise.
once turned away
Share of the land
now
they
waved
sought to
hello,
acquire.
and Sarah felt, for the first time in years, that her feet were planted on solid ground. But even the surest ground can tremble beneath old ghosts. It began with rumors, like most things in Willow Creek. Whispers started in the barber shop, fluttered through the aisles of Deacon's grocery. Mark had been spotted around town, not just passing through, but lingering. His once proud stride looked cramped now. His usual confidence dimmed by some invisible weight. People saw him sitting alone at the counter of the gas station diner, eyes sunken and hands restless as he poked at a plate of eggs he barely touched. Sarah heard about it first from Mrs. Jenkins, who popped in with her delivery of fresh milk and couldn't resist a little news. "Mark's back," she said quietly, as if afraid the walls might be listening. "Looks different, like a man carrying stones in his shoes." Sarah was not surprised. She had learned, the hard way, that nothing in life was immune to change or regret. But she had never allowed herself the luxury of imagining his return. Not after the clean finality of those first weeks. His duffel bag, his muttered apology, the way the headlights disappeared down Main Street, leaving her alone in echoing silence. Now, nearly 2 years later, life had etched lines of hardship and resilience into Sarah's face, but also laughter and pride. Her children were stronger, kinder. Emma scowled less and volunteered at the animal shelter. Ben wrote silly puns on the diner's chalkboard. Even little Maddie had grown into a sharp, unshakable presence by her side. There was no space in this rebuilt life for the man who'd walked out on them. Or so Sarah told herself. One cool Thursday, just after the breakfast rush, Mark appeared at Mama's kitchen. He didn't come into the diner's main entrance, but hovered outside, hat in hand, peering through the window. Sarah's heart thrummed in her chest, but she channeled the calm she'd learned to wear. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped outside, and stood quietly until he finally noticed her. He looked older, wearier. His hair was flecked with gray, his work boots scuffed and muddy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the street and the murmur of customers drifting through the gap. "Hey, Sarah," he said at last. His voice wavered, almost shy. "Mark," she replied, even and calm, waiting. He cleared his throat, eyes locked on the ground. I heard you were doing real well. Place looks nice." There was awkward gratitude, almost admiration, in his tone. Sarah simply nodded. "Thank you. The kids are doing well too." Mark brightened, but then his face folded in concern and regret. "I miss them. I know it's been a while, maybe too long, but I was hoping I could stop by, maybe see them, maybe talk." Sarah studied him for a moment. She saw the desperation behind his eyes, the thinness to his words. She knew, without asking, that things had not gone as he'd planned. The woman he'd left with was gone, vanished one morning without a note. His work had dried up in the city, and after a string of failed jobs and burned bridges, he'd drifted back to the only place he could call home. But home had moved on without him. Sarah agreed, cautiously, to let Mark visit the kids under her roof, not out of hope for reconciliation, but for their sake. The Miller children greeted their father with a complex mix of joy and wariness. Maddie clung to Sarah's apron. Ben offered a brittle smile, while Emma refused even to come downstairs. Mark's attempts at casual conversation faltered, his stories incomplete, flattened by the knowledge that he'd missed entire chapters of their lives. Over several awkward afternoons, Mark tried to fold himself into their routines, helped Ben with math homework, offered to fix a cabinet door, brought pizza on Fridays. But the fabric of the family was different now. The children turned to Sarah for guidance and comfort. Laughter bubbled up in her presence, not his. And Willow Creek, ever watchful, noticed how Mark's return was met not with open arms, but polite, distant nods. As weeks passed, Mark's disappointment and regret grew sharper. He tried to broach old hopes, making offhand comments about things being like they used to. One afternoon, he lingered in the empty diner after the lunch crowd had faded, nervously picking at the rim of his coffee mug. "Sarah, I made a mistake," he began quietly, leaving, walking out. "I thought I wanted something else, something easier, but I lost everything that really mattered. You, the kids, even this damn town." Sarah listened, a deep calm in her features. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind more than once. She knew now just how far she'd come. She was no longer the frightened, uncertain woman he had left. She was the heart of Mama's kitchen, the mother her children relied on, the neighbor others asked for advice. Her voice was gentle but unwavering. "Mark," she said, "for a long time I wished things could go back. I wished you'd never left, that our lives could be normal again. But that world is gone. We've learned to stand without you, and I'm proud of the life we have now. I'm not angry, not anymore, but I'm not the same woman you left, and this family doesn't need to be patched back the way it was." Tears sprang into Mark's eyes, but he nodded, understanding. There was nothing left for him to claim, no role to play except that of visitor, distant father, faded memory of what once was. Over time, Mark's visits grew fewer and farther between. He found odd jobs on the edge of town, but Willow Creek had already folded Sarah and her children into new rhythms that didn't require
I
his
didn't do anything, I
presence.
swear.
The townspeople, once
keep
so
walking,
invested
sir.
in the drama, now seemed to forget he had existed at all. Mama's kitchen was a landmark, Sarah its beating heart, and the Millers a family built not of absence, but resilience. Sarah sometimes wondered if forgiveness would ever feel complete. In her quieter moments, glancing at her children's sleeping faces or listening to diners laugh, she felt not bitterness, but a surprising
the easy
sense
way,
of freedom.
or we can
She
do
had
this the hard
survived
way.
abandonment
It's your
and
choice.
rejection, overcome judgment and despair.
missing something
The
critical
man
here.
who had
The
tried to
timeline
break
doesn't add
her
up.
was
What
now
about the
just a
car parked
shadow,
down the street? It wasn't
chasing
there
the warmth
earlier.
of a home he no longer knew. And as winter settled in, Sarah baked pies with her children, planned for a new year, and welcomed neighbors with the grace of someone who knew her own worth. The diner lights glowed through frosted windows, a beacon of second chances, not just for those who returned seeking forgiveness, but especially for those, like Sarah, who had built something beautiful from being left behind, a pricey revenge. For a long time, Sarah Miller thought about revenge the way wounded people often do, late at night, alone with her bruised pride and unanswered questions. When Mark left and the town closed its doors and hearts, she fantasized about all the ways she could show them someday. At first, the dream stung like salt in her wounds, glimmers of her ex-husband's regret, images of closed-off neighbors silenced by guilt. But as weeks turned to months and the ache dulled, her idea of revenge began to change. It softened into something less destructive and far more powerful. Revenge, she realized, didn't have to be about payback. It could be about living so well, so fully and unapologetically, that those who doubted her would have no choice but to look up in awe, embarrassment, or admiration. Bit by bit, she built a life that was its own kind of answer. The transformation wasn't sudden. Sarah still had her share of sleepless nights, financial headaches, and private moments of despair. But now, she faced them with a quiet determination, sharpened by every hard-earned victory. Her business, once a way to make ends meet, became her calling card, a vibrant, bustling diner at the center of Willow Creek. The sign above the door read, "Mama's Kitchen," but to many, its true meaning radiated from every scrubbed tabletop and every smile that greeted customers at dawn. Here was a place built not from charity, but from grit and skill. Every success, big or small, was a silent rebuke to those who had looked down on her after Mark's betrayal. There was a different kind of power in being able to pay the mortgage every month, in transforming debt into savings, in cutting the ribbon at the annual Willow Creek Food Fest as an honored guest rather than a subject of sympathy. Sarah couldn't help but notice the same townspeople who once offered her awkward pity now looked for her advice on baking, business, even matters of the heart. The community's attitude had shifted. The whispers were fewer, replaced by open acknowledgement. Some former critics became regulars at the diner, praising her pecan pie with genuine warmth. Mrs. Latham, who hadn't spoken to Sarah in years, showed up with her quilting club for lunch every Tuesday, never mentioning the past, but always bringing a bouquet for the table. Even the local pastor, whose sermons on faith and humility had once cut too close to Sarah's own shame, now stopped by for coffee and left with home-baked rolls for his children. But the most expensive revenge wasn't directed outward. It was internal, a reclamation of Sarah's self-worth. She learned that dignity wasn't assigned by others, but by herself. There was a price to be paid, of course. Years of inner work, forgiveness, and refusing to sink to the level of those who gossiped about her misfortune. The cost was letting go of pettiness and envy. the urge to throw Mark's failure in his face, or to outshine competitors out of spite. Each day, she invested in her own healing, her children's happiness, and a legacy that would outlast rumor. Sometimes, though, a confrontation was unavoidable. One autumn afternoon, during the town's harvest parade, Sarah found herself face to face with Mark. He was standing off to the side, eyes down, waiting for Maddie to finish her march with the scouts. The air was thick with old memories and unsaid things. But when Sarah approached, she saw not the man who had once broken her, but simply a tired father struggling with regret. "Sarah," he said, with a sheepish nod, "the kids look good. You look—" He trailed off, unsure. "Thank you," she replied, voice clear and even. "We're doing just fine." He tried to offer an apology, stiff, rehearsed. This time, though, Sarah found she didn't need it. Perhaps the biggest revenge was not needing anything at all from the one who hurt you. She'd already moved on. The distance between her and Mark measured not just in years, but in hard-won confidence. "What you did was hard on all of us," Sarah said quietly. "But it's over now. I hope you find your footing, Mark. I really do. As for us, we found ours." Mark nodded, surprisingly humbled, and stepped back into the crowd. The brief exchange, witnessed by a handful of locals, carried more meaning than any rumor ever could. In that moment, Sarah's refusal to welcome bitterness gave her a stature that shame and anger never would. Her children, too, became part of this narrative of victory. Emma gained the confidence to try new things, joining the debate club, applying for scholarships, sometimes even helping out in the kitchen. Ben's shyness began to thaw. He made friends, took up soccer, and volunteered at the animal shelter beside his sister. Maddie, the youngest, wore her mama's ambition like armor, telling everyone she wanted her very own bakery someday. Their laughter was unburdened, their arguments typical, their hugs fiercely loyal. No whisper in town could tarnish what they'd rebuilt together. The cost of their revenge was, in many ways, paid by letting go of resentment, of unhealthy patterns, of the need to prove anything further. Sarah found joy in other people's happiness and learned to celebrate their milestones, even if they were the same folks who'd once doubted her. She donated a percentage of Mama's Kitchen profits to the school's arts program, quietly set aside money for scholarships, and made it her mission to welcome newcomers who did not yet know how unforgiving small towns could be. Of course, there were bumps along the way. Business had its bad months. Bills sometimes stacked up.
Take your time.
Moments of loneliness crept in during holiday nights when other families gathered 2 by 2. Now, however, Sarah met these low points with grace, buoyed by the evidence of what she'd accomplished and by the sure knowledge that her story was no longer one of victimhood. The most telling moment of all came in the spring, at the Willow Creek Community Awards banquet. To her utter shock, Sarah was named Citizen of the Year, not for tragedy endured, but for contributions made. Neighbors she once thought had written her off stood to applaud. Sarah accepted the plaque with steady hands, her gaze moving from the audience to her children at the front row. In their eyes, she saw the only affirmation she truly needed. That night, as she walked through the quiet town, Sarah understood at last the real meaning of her revenge. It was never about making someone else hurt. It was about turning pain into purpose, absence into presence, and gossip into gratitude. The price was steep, but what she gained was invaluable. Respect, love, and the unshakable knowledge that she hadn't just survived, she'd triumphed. And so, in Willow Creek, her boldest response was not a cutting word or a public shaming, but the undeniable, everyday proof that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply a life well and bravely lived.